So the next presenter that we have will be virtual presentation. Jacqueline Quinless. So you've all been gifted this recently published book that she wrote called Decolonizing Data. And so these, and we're interested in, particular the data from an urban context. And so this will really help us, help inform our thoughts of the importance of non-extractive data and data that we retain as urban Indigenous peoples moving forward. So we have a presentation for the next hour and then about 15 minutes to pose questions. And then we'll just look at final wrap up and final words for the day. So Jacqueline, take it away.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Can everyone see my screen okay? Is it up there? Yeah, okay, great. So thanks everyone. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm joining you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Kwangin speaking people, Esquimalt, and Wasanic nations in Victoria, where I live with my family and is also my place of work. I recognize that many of you are located across diverse landscapes, so I also honor all of your traditional lands and waterways. I'm incredibly touched to be included in your gathering today for knowledge sharing and exchange, and a special shout out to Chelsea and Erwin for reaching out and inviting me, so thank you. So a bit about myself. I'm a second generation settler to Canada and a biracial person of Irish, British ancestry on my mother's side and Indian ethnicity from Hyderabad and Secunderabad, India, where my father, grandparents, and ancestors were born and lived. And I mentioned my family out of respect. I'm also very grateful and indebted to my family and my ancestors for their support in my work and the guidance that they've provided me throughout my life. I believe that my family and my lived experience as a biracial person has greatly influenced and shaped my commitment to anti-racist and anti-oppressive approaches in my research praxis. So that's the way I think about and also conduct my research work. Before I get started, I would like to just take a moment to express my very deep gratitude to Dr. Charlotte Lopi, who has been a leading Indigenous health researcher, for providing her reflections on the book in the foreword. Charlotte has helped me to shape my thinking in the book and has been a supportive mentor to me for many years. I'm especially grateful to my research partners at the First Nations Health Authority, and especially Dr. Shannon Waters for shaping this work, and to the University of Toronto Press and my editor, Jody Luchuk, and all of the Indigenous scholars who took time out of their very busy schedules to participate in a blind review of this work to offer insights for different considerations in the book, which ultimately I believe strengthened its content. I'm also especially grateful to Métis artist Christy Belcourt for supporting this work with her artwork. You'll see is embellishes the book, it embraces its contents. And with her piece entitled Wisdom of the Universe, Christy explains wisdom of the universe in a way that deeply resonates with me and captures what I believe is the spirit of the book. And so in Christy's words, the planet already contains all of the DNA and wisdom of the universe, as do you and I. It has the ability to recover built into its DNA, and we have the ability to change what we are doing so this can happen. This work and what I would like to share with you is about change and the way that I believe that data in particular can be used to transform people's lives. So this next slide, I'm just going to provide you with a bit of a brief overview of what I wanted to be sharing with you in this talk about equitable research data management, guiding principles or ethical sort of frameworks, and the role of data governance, which I believe is critical in community research and also in data sovereignty and ultimately in self-determination. So just to give you a bit of background, I like to talk in story. Prior to returning to academia to pursue my PhD in 2011, 10-year statistics, and my tenure with the federal government, I designed and created research courses, managed research services, and was part of the Gathering Strength Initiative, which came out of the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And as a member of the Gathering Strength Initiative, I worked in the Indigenous Statistical Training Program. And this brought me to work with numerous Indigenous communities across Western Canada and Inuit and Nantigat, teaching research design and data analysis, mostly from a quantitative perspective. This journey offered considerable teachings about the myriad of ways of doing good, but also very bad research with Indigenous peoples and communities. And really the book that you have emerged from these experiences, but also dovetailed into my doctoral work, which has been inspired by many different relationships. The first is when I traveled to a country called Bhutan, which is between China and India, to the Gross National Happiness Center as part of an international delegation to learn about an Indigenous knowledge approach to decolonizing the metrics of well-being. And as a country, Bhutan has never been formally colonized. And this experience and knowledge exchange taught me how localized Indigenous knowledge systems and larger data systems can actually coincide together to produce health or well-being outcomes for people that are rooted in what they value. And this can be tracked and measured over time. The second relationship is with my colleague and now longtime friend, Dr. Shannon Water, who is from the Chemainus community here on Vancouver Island and is currently the Chief Medical Officer for Vancouver Island Health. And we met in 2012 at an Indigenous data conference in Vancouver after I'd given a talk on the metrics of well-being. And so she approached me and she asked me what I thought about the importance of data in health. And I told her I thought data could be used to transform people's lives by enhancing their health and well-being, and that data is relational. So we connected right away and started looking at ways that the First Nations Health Authority, which was newly emerged in 2013 here in BC, could be using the First Nations perspective on health and wellness to shift health outcomes. And so I share these stories with you because the people that I meet are reflected in the data, but these are relationships and they're important to me. And they've really shaped my work and are at the heart of the book, where I consider more diverse, equitable, and inclusive approaches to community-based research and reflect on how to work with Indigenous knowledge systems and worldviews in a respectful way to address social, economic, and health inequalities. So drawing on both Western and Indigenous methodologies, I look at inequality both from a sociological perspective and also a two-eyed seeing approach put forward by Elder Albert Marshall to research methods by looking at the ways that everyday research practices, so the way that we think about and we do research, contribute to the colonization of health outcomes for Indigenous people. So when we think about data, often many things come to mind for folks. And what I've come to learn in this process, it's not just numbers and surveys. Data encompasses a wide range of different sorts of knowledges. And so just to give you an example, and this is certainly not an exclusive list or comprehensive by any means, but just to give you an idea, data can come from presentation and talks like we're doing right now. It informs policy. It's a community of practice. It can be flat data, processed data, unprocessed data, code, script, hierarchical, digital data. Everything is data. It describes an event, a phenomenon. It can be expressed in articles, books, websites, blogs, posts. It can be a continuum over time. It's how we see the world or our worldview or lens, information that we gather. And it can be also numbers, plots, graphs, parameters, tables, figures, maps. There's a lot of diversity when we think about a data ecosystem. And so I just wanted to share this with you. And it's related to some of the work that I've done while I spent some time doing a postdoctoral fellowship as a data fellow. I was working with the University of Victoria and researchers across the data ecosystem. And so when I met with people at the university, I really wanted to know what they thought about their digital landscape. And so this just gives you some words that people were using to describe their experiences of data. In the humanities, someone mentioned that it's a manila folder in a filing cabinet, and that's our data. And certainly I have lots of those kind of folders around my office and keep information in those places as well. We're creating image files, we're creating PDFs, we're creating XLM, we're creating websites, all sorts of things, but it's still flat data. Ways that our community kind of relates to the world. So it's our worldview. It's got to be embedded in a sense of language, ceremony, the land or the water that you're in, and our histories, so that those interrelationships are key. So I guess what you think of, especially in Indigenous forms of knowledge or data, so Indigenous studies, it's unprocessed data, processed data, images, continuous live data coming in through on time, body composition over time, so someone from the sciences, and then from the fine arts, someone mentioned to me, it's everything: knowledge, information, stories, gossip, rumors, songs. And so I share this with you just to give, in other people's words, sort of their interpretations of how they work with data. In this next slide, I wanted to share with you, and again, it's not a comprehensive list, but just some examples of different types of methods or tools that people can use in order to gather that data. So it could be through observation or participation. It could be interviews, and they could be semi-structured. They could be in-depth. Online chat forums, surveys, of course, are notorious for producing all sorts of quantitative data. Ceremony, lots of really important works, especially by Sean Wilson, talks about research as ceremony. Community conversations, sometimes in the social scientists, we'll call that focus groups. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but just to show you a variety of different ways in which people can use different methods in order to gather data. So this then makes me think about data in the context of an ecosystem. And then once we start to sort of look at data in those kind of ways, then we can understand that if it's in an ecosystem, it likely has some kind of longevity or life cycle. And I wanted to share with you some thoughts I have about the data life cycle management process. And really, data is a life cycle. And the data life cycle management is a process of overseeing the entire journey of data, from its creation to its eventual disposal or infeasibility. And it involves managing the storage, accessibility, and security of data to ensure it remains accurate, relevant, valuable throughout its life cycle. The data life cycle and its management ensures efficient use of data resources and reduces the risk of data loss. So when we think about a life cycle, I think of a process. And in this life cycle, there's various different sort of stages in that process. And that can be from planning, initial scoping of projects, discussions, meetings, to putting methods together to start to gather or compile that information, then taking that data and processing it in some capacity, taking time to synthesize it and analyze it, looking at ways to preserve it, keep it safe, keep it secure. And then also mobilization. So that has to do with knowledge sharing of the information, and often it's reuse. So there's a repurpose in data. And these are not all of the stages. There can be many other kinds of components within these stages, but just to give you a general idea. And as I've been working in this field for close to two and a half decades now, I've been thinking a lot about, well, what does this mean for Indigenous data? And so when we think about life cycles and we think about, the complexity and diversity of data, often we need to sort of consider aspects of management or governance of data, because this becomes sort of more of the framework to sort of manage this process throughout its life cycle or its journey. And if you're new to the world of data governance and management, I know all of this information can be a bit overwhelming. I will provide the slides for you, so you've got a resource that you can refer to as you move forward. But over the past 2 decades or so, Indigenous communities and governments have been shifting the power balance around access to data about their citizens and community members and the methods used to research and gather this data. And really, when I come to think about data and research, I know that these terms in particular have very painful connotations for many Indigenous people in Canada. There are numerous examples throughout history of unethical, exploitive, and otherwise harmful research studies and methods performed by settlers on Indigenous people and communities and lands. When an Indigenous government or community takes control of the data collected about their people, I believe that they gain power to determine the story that data tells, and they can use it to support efforts towards self-determination and also sovereignty. So certainly data gathering has existed for a long time, and Indigenous people have been gathering data on their communities and their people since time immemorial. So these are not new ways of managing information. But when we put it in a contemporary context, data gathering is an active and ongoing management process, and that involves certain components. The first is something called data curation, and that involves the creating of information, so collecting and taking care of research data. It involves sharing of that information, so revealing the data's potential across domains, and that may involve indexing, cataloging, archiving that information, the storage of the information, and then also preserving the data, so promoting the reuse and new combinations of data for other types of value add. There are 2 types of roles that are often involved in this data management process. The first is data curators, and they are the owners of data sets and their metadata to ensure more context for data users. The next is data stewards. Data stewards are also owners responsible for the databases and knowledge systems to which the data pertain to. So how then does this apply to Indigenous people and communities in the context of data governance and management? Well, it's a really important, timely topic, because if we think about data collection initiatives, whether they're from federal government organizations, provincial governments, nonprofits, a variety of different tools, it can be even an online corporation that's collecting information. The point of the story is data collection initiatives about Indigenous peoples, particularly in Canada, have been part of an ongoing process of colonization and experienced as acts of violence and genocide. In fact, the impacts of colonialism are widespread and persistent throughout provincial systems and policies, and they're embedded in the justice system, the education system, the healthcare system, and the child welfare system, just to name a few. And this relates to a term called data colonialism. And that's data gathering practices that have created systemic and institutional racism and inequality among many other types of harms. And it continues to dominate through a process of capitalist accumulation by dispossession. The term data colonialism was coined by Professor Nick Caldry and Ulysses Mahias, just so that is there for your reference. So when we think about data and we think about rights and Indigenous people, I'm not here to talk about sovereignty. That's for Indigenous people to determine. But I am familiar with data, and I think there is a strong relationship between data sovereignty, and self-determination. And if we put this in the context of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, Indigenous people, again, have been governing and managing their knowledge systems since time immemorial. When we think about data in the context of UNDRIP, we can begin to see that there's a correlation between data and specific rights. Indigenous people have the right to maintain control protect, and develop their cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and cultural expressions, which includes all forms of knowledge. And so some examples of that could be medicines, sacred living histories, oral traditions, and really all of the ways of being and knowing in the world. Indigenous people also have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop their intellectual property. So one of the things I wanted to share is that in BC in 2019, the provincial government DRIPA. And in terms of data, the following are 4 key areas of the legislation that I wanted to share. The first is Section 3 that mandates the government to bring provincial laws into alignment with the UN Declaration. Section 4 requires the province to develop and implement an action plan in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous people to meet the objectives of the UN Declaration. Section 5 requires regular reporting to the legislature to monitor progress on the alignment of laws and implementation of the action plan, including tabling annual reports by June 30th of each year. And Sections 6 and 7 allow for flexibility for the province to enter into agreements with a broader range of Indigenous governments to exercise statutory decision-making authority together. So in terms of data, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, again, data governance becomes really important in this process. And if you're new to the world of data governance and management, I know all of this information can be overwhelming. Over the past 2 decades or so, Indigenous communities and governments have been shifting again the power balance around access to data about their citizens and their community members, and the various different methods used to research and gather this data. I know that there are often harmful connotations when we think about research and data throughout history. And I really believe that when Indigenous governments and communities take control of data collected about their people, they can gain the power to determine the story the data tells and use it to support efforts towards self-determination and sovereignty. So what then is Indigenous data sovereignty? The current movement towards open data and open science, which has been promoted in many different institutions within the government, within academia, within the nonprofit sector, within the private sector, really, in my opinion, does not fully engage with Indigenous people's rights and interests. It is only when Indigenous governments and organizations and communities take control of data collected about their people, they gain power to determine the story that the data tells. And again, they can use that to support efforts in self-determination and sovereignty. So data sovereignty and Indigenous data sovereignty can be understood as the right of a nation, group of people, or individual to exert control over the governance of data collection, application, and ownership. And data governance is the responsibility that goes along with this assertion of this right. So this slide provides you just with a sort of visual picture of some of the things that I've been describing. The articulation of Indigenous people's rights and interest in data about their people, communities, cultures, and territories as part of reclaiming control of data ecosystems, data science, and data narratives in the context of open data and open science. Control, coupled with a focus on collective benefit and equity, repositions Indigenous peoples, nations, and communities from being subjects of data that perpetuate unequal power distributions to self-determining users of data for development of well-being. Harnessing data for governance and acting in the governance of data shifts Indigenous peoples from invisibility within data ecosystems to vibrant contributors to data policies, practices, ethics, and innovation. So in this next slide, and I'm not sure if Chelsea maybe did, if you've got the links. If not, I can try and pull it up. I wanted to share with you some video clips about the data principles of the FNIGC and also OCAP with a colleague of mine, Gwen Phillips. I'm always very grateful to Gwen when we work together. I have a lot of respect for Gwen, and she teaches me a great deal about data principles, and also from a Ktunaxa view about the importance of language and data sovereignty rights and individuals. So in Gwen's words, I'd like to share some of her thoughts, and also with the FNIGC. So I'm not sure maybe if you've got that link. If not, I can certainly pull it up. I'm just not sure how that will work with the sound. Maybe if someone could let me know, that's great. Thank you.
And so for us, our interest is to collect data that helps us to determine how strong and healthy we are as the Ktunaxa peoples. What the federal government is working on is to close the gap between how well we are and Canadians. And for us, that's measuring assimilation. Why would we do that? And so self-determination is deciding who you are, who you were, who you are, and who you want to be. And data goes right along with that. And so
Thank you. And then we'll just turn over to the next video from FNIGC.
First Nations people have always understood the value of community, the importance of respect, and the need to protect our resources for future generations. And today, one of our most important resources is information. First Nations people have always been information gatherers. When we track and hunt or gather food from the land, we're engaging in information gathering that has a direct and important impact on our lives. First Nations people understand that information isn't just about numbers and surveys. It's about culture, identity, traditions, and self-determination. That's why the First Nation Information Governance Centre was created. Since 1996, its mission has been to uphold the values of OCAP, a set of principles designed to protect First Nations ownership and jurisdiction over their information, and ensure that First Nations people are the stewards of their own information. OCAP ensures that First Nations people have ownership both individually and collectively as a community. It puts them in control so that they can decide how it is used, by whom, and under what conditions. It ensures that they have the right to determine and define access regardless of where it is held. And it defines possession, ensuring that they have the power to use their information for the benefit of their own communities. Possession is key to making ownership, access, and control possible. Taken together, the First Nations principles of OCAP embody one important idea: that First Nations people understand their own needs and are in the best position to govern their own information. The right of First Nations communities to own, control, access, and possess information about their peoples is fundamentally tied to self-determination and to the preservation and development of their culture.
First Nations Information Governance Centre is a national body that supports First Nations from across Canada in advancing our interests around information and data management and governance.
Their job is essentially to assert First Nations ownership, control, access, and possession into the data collection and survey research which is being done in the country. I think their primary goal is to make sure that First Nations are directly involved in every aspect, and in fact they have taken the lead in a couple of major surveys in the country.
Basically, our mission is to support local and regional capacity for data and information collection, interpretation, analysis, and translating it into knowledge, and then making it available to leadership for good, sound decision-making, evidence-based decision-making.
For First Nations, this is important because it helps create a standard for their relationships that they have with researchers, and it creates an ethical space where they can facilitate the conversation around research and making sure that it's culturally appropriate safe for the community to participate in.
Though OCAP is trademarked by the First Nations Information Governance Center, it is owned by the First Nation communities, and it helps them and guides them in the work that they do in research.
OCAP helps First Nations to have self-determination because the information is theirs.
The First Nation themselves are in the position to determine how their information is utilized, accessed, gathered, and interpreted. I think that's one of the important elements about OCAP is that First Nations have control of their information. They need to be part of the interpretation of that information as well.
It's important that they have the final say because ultimately this information is about them.
Achieving recognition of our sovereignty and exercising our sovereignty is essentially the fundamental goal, and the purpose for exercising that, achieving that recognition and exercising that sovereignty is really to improve the quality of life of our people and to return to the balance in the government-to-government relationship.
We've got to have the ability to measure our well-being in terms that make sense to us, and we actually want that well-being described in positive terms. The RHS, or the Regional Health Survey, was an attempt by the federal government to actually gauge the well-being of First Nations across Canada. Being that we are a very diverse population and of huge geography, it's really challenging from an Ottawa perspective to actually measure what's going on in the communities.
First Nations people understand that we're living in an evidence-based world, and in order to affect positive policy change for our communities, we need to have that credible data that we can quote and refer back to in order to gauge where we're going to go to next in the future.
First Nations people need to be the stewards of their own information because we know best what is the best processes for us, and we can manage our own information.
That information is crucial for us to also do our research. If we don't, then we don't have accurate information. You can't plan for a cohesive, healthy future.
Governance matters. Being able to actually define where you want to go and how you're going to get there is key. Being informed along the way is a very important aspect of that. The destination and the journey, two parts of it. The roadmap is what's going to get you there. And good information, good data management is actually the roadmap to the future.
Thank you so much. And so you had an opportunity to hear from Indigenous data experts about really important components of ownership, control, access, and possession, but also data governance, data sovereignty. And the book that you have in front of you really was written for non-Indigenous community members, researchers, practitioners, so that they can sort of invite and consider the ways in which they are supporting certain ways of thinking and also carrying out their research activities that create harmful impacts in terms of data outcomes. So with ownership, control, access, and possession, these are sort of fundamental principles that have been coined by the First Nations Information Governance Center, and you certainly can get more details on OCAP if you visit the FNIGC website, and this is also where the video is available. But when we think about ownership, it is the relationship of First Nations to their culture, knowledge, data, and information. A community or group owns information collectively in the same way that an individual owns his or her personal information. In terms of control, First Nations, their communities and representative bodies within their seeking over all aspects of research and information management processes that impact them. This can include all stages of a particular research project from start to finish. The principle extends to the control of resources and review processes, the planning process, management of the information, and many other components. Access is First Nations must have access to information and data about themselves and their communities, regardless of where it is held. This also refers to the right of First Nation communities and organizations to manage and make decisions regarding access to their collective information. And then possession is the physical control of data. Possession is the mechanism by which ownership can be asserted and protected. And so those are some definitions taken from OCAP at the FNIGC for you to consider. So some other things I wanted to share with you is there are OCAP principles that are really important in guiding some of the frameworks. But again, the current movement towards open data and open science does not fully engage with Indigenous people's rights and interests. Existing principles within the open data movement, such as the FAIR principles, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, primarily focus on characteristics of data that will facilitate increased data sharing among entities while ignoring power differentials and historical context. The emphasis on greater data sharing alone creates a tension for Indigenous people who are also asserting greater control over the application and use of Indigenous data and Indigenous knowledge for collective benefit. So the other sort of set of principles that I wanted to bring your attention to are the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. And they are people and purpose oriented. They reflect the crucial role of data in advancing Indigenous innovation and self-determination. These principles complement the existing FAIR principles, encouraging open and other data movements to consider both people and purpose in their advocacy and pursuits. So concerns about secondary use of data and limited opportunities for benefit sharing have focused attention on the tension that Indigenous communities feel between one, protecting Indigenous rights and interest in Indigenous data, including traditional knowledges, and two, supporting open data, machine learning, broad data sharing, and big data initiatives. The International Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group is a network of nation-state-based Indigenous data sovereignty networks and individuals that developed the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance in consultation with Indigenous people, scholars, non-profit organizations, and governments. And so they're there for you to consider. In terms of collective benefit, that involves data ecosystems should be designed and function in ways that enable Indigenous people to derive benefit from data. Authority to control is Indigenous people's rights and interests in Indigenous data must be recognized, and their authority to control such data should be empowered. Indigenous data governance enables Indigenous people to determine how they are represented within this data. Responsibility. Those working with Indigenous data have a responsibility to share how this data is used to support Indigenous people's self-determination and collective benefit. And ethics. Indigenous people's rights and well-being should be the primary concern at all stages of the data lifecycle. And I showed you a screen share earlier of the different stages in the data lifecycle. This next slide, again, you can use as you move forward in your work. But it really just makes a sort of comparison of data principles between Indigenous data sovereigntists and sort of mainstream approaches to data generation and data gathering. And so this is from New Zealand, so the Indigenous data sovereignty principles, Australia's Indigenous data sovereignty protocols, United States Indigenous data governance principles, and Canada Indigenous data governance and principles. And so a few of those, and then looking at sort of mainstream open data charter principles, FAIR principles for data management and stewardship, and stream properties for industrial and commoditized data. So that's there as a snapshot to sort of give you some comparisons in a really kind of synthesized way.
Sorry, Jacqueline, Chelsea speaking here. Since the video, we haven't been able to see your slideshow.
Oh, okay, thank you.
But I know that that slide is a very good one, so I wanted
It is a good one, thank you. All righty, let me just go and see if I can do a screen share here. I'll go back to this slide then, because it is a good one. There you go. So these are the data principles that I was just mentioning, and I'll reiterate that. So looking at Indigenous and mainstream sort of principles, if from New Zealand, you have Indigenous data sovereignty principles, Australia, Indigenous data sovereignty protocols, in the United States, Indigenous data governance principles, and in Canada, Indigenous data governance and principles. And there's many of them listed. For mainstream, we're looking at open data charter principles, the FAIR principles for data management and stewardship, and stream properties for industrial and commoditized data. So just to give you a really sort of synthesized way of looking at some of these principles and some of their similarities, but also the tensions and omissions in all of these types of approaches and principles and ethics. So I wanted to leave you with some questions and just for your consideration around the CARE principles. So just thinking a little bit about ethics and the way in which we create, as what Willie Ermine talks about, an ethical space when we're interacting with organizations, with people, with community. You know, there's 4 questions that I'll leave you with in terms of these CARE principles. So here are the first 2, and then the second 2, and so 4 in total, thinking about some of the ways in which you can approach some of your conversations moving forward from many of the things that I've shared with you during this presentation. So on that note, this brings me to the end of what I wanted to share with you. I'm not sure if we're going to move it over to any questions or comments, but I'm certainly happy to take those. And thank you so much again for inviting me here to share with you. I hope my work is helpful in supporting you as you move forward.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline. This is incredible information. And, you know, one of the biggest takeaways, I think, from the first video that you shared is that our current evaluation infrastructures measure assimilation, how well we are assimilating. And that is a big, you know, thought to think about. And I never thought about that. And it's just one of those ways that racism is insidiously built into how it is that we think, that has become hidden in the ways that we move forward. So it was incredible information. It is definitely a lot for us to think about as we move forward into a process of how it is that we kind of mine and gather our own data moving forward to be able to perform an evaluation. So I do want to actually open it up to see if anybody has any thoughts or comments or questions while we still have you. It's a lot to think about. Yes, we do have a question.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Katrina Philpott and I'm from Victoria. So hi. I think you mentioned that your book is really focused towards non-Indigenous people. However, as an urban Indigenous woman, data sovereignty and sharing that knowledge with my friends and family and community is really important. I guess one easy example is data sovereignty in healthcare. And so recently I was diagnosed with chronic illness, and each doctor that I spoke to, I would say, oh, inflammatory arthritis. Do you have any studies and reports of Indigenous people with this illness? No. Oh, do you have any studies and reports on Inuit with this chronic illness? No. And so in every aspect of my life, I question the people that I interact with to improve myself, to improve the dialogue, the open dialogue, to allow the professionals that I speak with or friends and to question the work that they're doing and whether it's valid or not valid. And so I just want to say thank you, but for your book. It's really good. But it's also, I think it's also important for Indigenous people to understand to share that knowledge in a way, because not all of us understand that. And that's something, 5 years ago, I didn't understand the importance of data sovereignty. But I just wanted to say thank you.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate your good words and also for sharing your story. And, I think about in the book, I do talk a lot about cultural safety. And really a lot of questions I pose in the book for people to reflect on the way in which, again, we think about and we act in the world. And so I just wanted to say thank you for sharing your story. It was really meaningful and really taking that to heart.
Thank you, Jacqueline. We do have another question. Dodie?
Hi, this is Dodie. Thank you for your presentation. And I just have a question. In your experiences through your work, do you have any comments or thoughts on how media, and I think sometimes when I think of media, I think about journalists or that, how they use data when it comes to talking about or reporting on Indigenous people? Any thoughts, any comments, or anything that came up in your research?
Thank you. That's a really good question and a really important question. In my work, I think that there's sort of some thoughts that I've put together on knowledge mobilization. And so really, data in itself tells stories. And I think even StatCan has a course called, data storytelling or stories through data. But really, I think that people do refer to information when they're sharing. And I think that's also very much linked to the way in which we interact ethically with the knowledge that's presented. I have really deep questions about someone who maybe takes a statistic from whatever organization that may be and then presents on it, not understanding, the question itself, how it was asked, was it actually validated and was it created by community? Who put that question together? What knowledge is it generating? And often the media can be an extension. So they're kind of recreating the social construction of reality in many ways. And so I remember, I'm just going back to an experience when I was teaching in the Indigenous Statistical Training course, and through some of those exchanges, we had a few people from the media come to one of the courses. It was like a surveys from start to finish. And I'm really glad that they attended, because often people will just use like data, like statistics, and they'll present on that, not really knowing that doesn't tell the whole picture. So I remember we had put together sort of a question list of 15 or 20 questions you should ask when you see a statistic. And I did find that the folks who came from the media found that very helpful. And I think in the book, I kind of get at some of those deeper issues, like, where does this number come from? What does it represent? And when you put it out to the world, can it be misrepresented? And so I think that, yes, there's a factual component to numbers, but there's also a subjective interpretation that happens. And I think that we need to be pretty honest about these conversations. And there needs to be a bit more of a critical engagement or critical data studies when we think about the numbers that we're using and the way that they're representing certain things. So hopefully that answers your question. But yeah, I think the media has a big role to play, and it would be great to see folks, engaging in these deeper questions with knowledge generation and knowledge sharing.
That is so valuable and thought-provoking. Thank you. It was a good question. Do we have any other questions from the floor? I'm not seeing anybody standing at the microphone, so I wanted to thank you so much. As I said, lots to take away from that. And we were all gifted copies of your book. I really can't wait to read it. So thank you so much, Jacqueline, for being with us this afternoon, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you so much for having me. It was good to meet everybody. It was an honor. So thank you. And if anybody needs anything, you know how to get a hold of me. Okay. All right. Thank you. Good luck with the rest of your gathering.
Thank you. Take care.